The time had finally come. The wait was long overdue. And finally in 2025, it had finally been found. What's up, everybody? This is Willie, and we're back talking about Backyardigans. And color me surprised, I would have never expected to make a review on this thing, but here we are. And what I'm talking about, it's a lost media pilot of Me and My Friends. Which brings us back to my retrospective review. I did briefly acknowledge it. And there's Me and My Friends, which have some relation to the Backyardigans. But yeah, Me and My Friends is among one of the Backyardigans pilots that was pretty much gatekept for these years. So it was very surreal for someone to finally discover this lost media and bring it to the public, which finally gave me the chance to react to it. And now that I've watched it, there's a lot for me to break down in my review from the Me and My Friends pilot. Now, to preface what I'm going to do in this video, it's going to be subjective on what the pilot was all about, so I'm not going to elaborate on the context surrounding the discovery of it. And to further add on top of my review, I'm also going to be breaking down a lot of interesting aspects that this pilot entailed, considering how much of a distinction they would have in comparison to what we would end up getting in the animated version. So it'll be cool to really walk through a lot of the differences this pilot has. So enough said, let's get right into the review. So this thing begins with the usual TV show intro that every kids show should have, but this one is vastly different than the one we're familiar with to this day, where yes, they did stick around with the "hi, I'm this character" stuff like that. And of course, if you don't know, the Me and My Friends pilot is also live action with these puppet costumes as their main gig, and that's a bit interesting, you know, kind of giving off those Sesame Street-esque vibes, even though they're technically not Muppets. But yeah, something that just tells us that this show was not intended to be digital, but you know, I am glad that they shifted to the CGI animation instead. But anyways, the pilot truly starts off with Pablo, who is super stoked because he's going to be playing flag tag with his friends, and Uniqua is going to be bringing the flags over. So he's super excited, and that's when he passes by some meerkats, who do point out that Pablo's pet peeve is waiting, which I wonder what the theme of this episode is going to be. But anyways, Pablo goes and interacts with the meerkats, who then point out to him that Uniqua is not there yet and he just has to wait. So then Pablo beats up with Tyrone and Tasha, who are just pretending to be airplanes while I guess they're waiting, even though Pablo doesn't pick up on their motives. Just then, Uniqua finally arrives with the flags, which she has created each of them their own flag. But then it comes to the issue that she didn't have time to glue the flags on the poles, which is like, dude, you could have just added some more time doing that instead of rushing all the way there just to break the news. Plus, also, since glue does take time to dry, by the time you probably brought it over to them, it would have been dry. Like, seriously, Uniqua. But anyways, the characters just glue the flags on the poles, and now they just have to wait for it to dry, which is something that Pablo does not want to do. And he clearly shows a lot of impatience as he's waiting, because he seriously just wants to play flag tag, which I can get that too. But sometimes you should use your waiting time effectively, which is what Pablo didn't seem to recognize. Like, play a fun icebreaker game or something. Like back time when this thing was released, you would have been doing something like that during your wait time. Well, in the present day, like now, people would just be on their phones, scrolling or playing a video game while they wait. But hey, that is an example of using your wait time effectively. But Pablo is not patient enough, and he rushes to try to get the game started as he assumes the glue had dried up by now, even though it hadn't been over a minute. But when he says so, everyone else takes his word for it and starts playing, which you should really rely on Pablo on that front. And also, you should have been counting the time it was drying yourself, and somehow nobody really recognized that. But anyways, they play some flag tag, only for their respective flags to drop off their pole one by one by one. And they're clearly disappointed, but Pablo is at fault for not waiting long enough for the glue to dry, so he is responsible for this debacle. And this frustrates Uniqua to where she finally dashes away into some shed, and Pablo is feeling guilty for ruining the game. And finally, Uniqua just pops out for a second to lecture him that he didn't wait long enough before hiding away in that shed again for some reason. But the most obvious solution is to just glue them back together, but that means it adds on more wait time, which is not what Pablo wants, but it's clearly no choice that he has. And when the friends call Uniqua back out to help to fix the flags, which she agrees to, but on a condition that Pablo shall not touch them before they're dry, or else he will not be participating in flag tag anymore, which that is a fair condition to make, which will teach Pablo the merits of waiting. So after they glue them back together, Uniqua, Tasha, and Tyrone use their wait time effectively with doing other things. Meanwhile, Pablo is just standing there feeling flustered that he has to wait. So then he heads over to the meerkats to talk with them and opens up his hatred for waiting, just then for them to point out that he is indeed waiting in a way where he's using his waiting time to chat with them. And on top of that, he's also gonna sing a song about waiting, and I did like the rhythm to it. So after his singing, Uniqua points out that they've waited long enough so they can try playing flag tag again, and they test out the flags to see if the glue solidified, and it did. So now they're happy to play. And we get a sign off from Pablo where he reflects on overcoming his issues with waiting, which does fulfill the themes of this episode being about patience. So that was satisfying. And you know what? I might as well talk about the fact that the pilot's theme about waiting and patience is kind of ironic coming from the more outside circumstances surrounding it, with us fans having to wait long for this to finally be released to the public. So that's me and my friends for you. Definitely not your typical Backyardigans episode, which is clear cut considering the name wasn't even going to be the Backyardigans. And this pilot does further give me a lot of impressions of what the show intended to do, and ended up making a lot of vast changes that would contribute to the animated product that we're familiar with to this day. And to illustrate that, let's break down and highlight some of the differences that this pilot offered. First thing is what I already mentioned about the characters being more live action puppets, which was a unique difference. If the show did move forward with this formula, I wouldn't mind it either, but then again, with the installment of the animated version, clearly the latter was for the better. And that brings us to the premise, which the whole setting of what the show was planning to be was not gonna be these characters adventuring in the backyard where they would embark on imaginary adventures there. Like, me and my friends was gonna be like those standardized stories that introduce a lot of morals for the characters to learn from, and on that front, it's alright, but I think my thrill is kind of lessened on that because the setting is not really diverse or anything. And to be fair, the storyline is solid, does resonate with me, just like the Backyardigans episodes, and I think the installment really did a good job building upon the potential storylines from this episode and making them even more better and palpable. The next thing and most obvious one is the lack of Austin. Where is that purple kangaroo when you need him? But from what I understand, he was planned to be on the show, but definitely not a significant role than what he would have later on in the official installment, which I think the latter option was the best choice to make, because then we can add another character to the mix, and Austin would end up being one of the characters that I will relate to a lot. So from my personal impressions, Austin was going to be a character, but definitely more on the sidelines than having any sort of prominence. And then following up the big elephant in the room, or not really elephants, it's the meerkats, which I'm kind of conflicting on with what their role intended to be, which from my impression, they didn't seem that relevant. Like, yeah, maybe just giving some sort of narration of what the characters are doing, which is fine, but if they did end up translating to the Backyardigans, I don't think their role would have worked, as they would probably ruin the pacing for the episodes. And honestly, I am glad they were removed in the process, as their roles felt a bit more stereotypical with those kind of character archetypes that you would see on given kids shows around those times. And me and my friends was probably gonna retread that, but I'm glad they shifted themselves away from that trope and went on to create a show in a more independent pacing. And that sums up many of the differences to highlight from this pilot, as most of the stuff introduced here stayed the same, like the characters, their charisma and charming personalities, and of course the best of all, the singing, which the song here was a slight banger, much better than any sort of song from modern animation to this day. Like, this show really had the right idea with where they're going. They just added more modifications to the show to strengthen its quality, and they pretty much succeeded in that with their installment of the Backyardigans. So I personally think Me and My Friends was a decent introduction to the early intentions of what the show was going to be, but I think a lot of the things that they adjusted in the process bolstered the show for the better, and I'm so happy where the show ended up being. I am a straight up diehard fan of the main franchise, and it was a great feeling to do a binge rewatch last year to really get that pure nostalgia, and over time this show is partially the reason that this channel ended up being what it is now. So any sort of media that I'm able to cover in relation to the show, I'm up for it. And this factors in why I decided to cover this pilot, to really get an impression on what the show's premise was initially going to be, and analyzing a lot of what they modified when transferring over to the CGI animation. So all in all, I am satisfied with the show's trajectory and the bevy amount of changes they made for the better. And that wraps up my coverage on the Me and My Friends pilot. What a unique concept it was, and the overall execution is decent, but it does make me reflect on how pleased I am alongside everyone else that we ended up getting a much more better quality version of this show, which contributed to its great reputation and success. And I still continue to look forward to covering some interesting topics in relation to the Backyardigans, so click that subscribe and tap that like for more of that style of content. So I'm going to end things off here, and I appreciate y'all tuning in.